Dr. Humer, I want to start with Qualia first. You give Qualia as an argument, or maybe some arguments from Qualia, for thinking that the mind is immaterial. Can you help us out? Why does Qualia? What is Qualia first, and then
Yeah.
why think that it leads to substance dualism?
Yeah. So, qualia are, well, frequently said to be what it's like to have a mental state. It's
Mhm.
supposed to be a property that a mental state has, and that property is, what it's like. So, this comes from Thomas Nagel's article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Where
Right.
he says the fact that an organism is conscious means that there is something it is like to be that organism. So, like you think intuitively, there's nothing that it's like to be a rock, but there's something that it's like to be a bat, for
Mm.
example, because bats are conscious beings. And actually, it's an interesting question and something unknown to us what it's like to be a bat, because they navigate by echolocation, so they have information that's like the information we have when we look at things, but they're getting it by their ears. So what is that like? So anyway, okay. So there's like, there's some characteristic of the experience that's sort of like the, an inherently first person, whatever, first person nature. And that's, and it's this thing that, intuitively you think you would only be able to understand it if you have had similar experiences. So
Mm.
like, we don't know what it's like to be a bat because we've never had that experience. Um, and then, okay, yeah. So, um, and what does this have to do with physicalism? Um, it's hard to explain what qualia are, in physical terms. Like,
Mm.
this doesn't sound like a physical property. At least it's not. It's not what I would think the word physical referring to,
Yeah.
right? Like sort of like feeling a certain way. And Nagel's article is, very interesting and of course very famous, like justly famous. Because like one of the things he talks about is he compares other cases in which there's a reductionist account of something. So like there's a reductionist account of heat, and he says, when you explain the nature of heat, you don't have to explain the feel of it,
Hmm.
like right, and that's good because when they say, oh, there are these molecules that are moving around fast, and like that's what heat is, um, you're like, wow, that doesn't seem like that's what it is. But like it's okay because you don't have to explain the feel of it, because the feel of it isn't part of the phenomenon. The feel of it is the effect that the real external phenomenon produces in your mind.
Right.
So that's why the theoretical reduction doesn't have to explain that. But if you're trying to explain qualia, no, the feel of it is the phenomenon.
Yeah.
So you can't say, oh, we don't have to explain that part because that's just an effect that the phenomenon produces on human minds, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so and then Nagel says, and justly, like we don't like have a conception of how you could give a reductionist account of qualia.
Yeah. That's good. Well, Dr. Oppy, do you? I thought I read somewhere that you don't believe in qualia.
Okay, so let's add a little bit more to the story. So I want to talk about a particular thought experiment, the one
Hmm.
that Frank Jackson is really famous for,
Yeah.
The neuroscientist in the black and white room. So the way that and this story for many people kind of brings out the difficulties in giving any kind of, I mean, say, physicalist account of qualia, though whether I'm a physicalist is kind of open to debate. That's something that we'll come to in a bit. So Jackson asks us to imagine very well equipped, I'll say neuroscientists, but we're to imagine that they're enclosed in a room where everything's in black and white. There's no colors, where you kind of imagine a way difficulties like what if she takes a scalpel to herself or something like that. We're supposed to just pretend that that doesn't happen, right? So,
Yeah.
so all of her visual experience is in black and white, but we suppose that she's very well equipped, and she actually is so well equipped as a scientist, a physicist, that she knows everything there is to know about the physical state of the universe everywhere at all times. So she's got exhaustive physical knowledge. Maybe we don't have to make it quite that extensive, but we may as well for the purposes of the thought experiment. So, so there's Mary in the black and white room. She knows all this physical stuff. So she knows everything about the physics of her brain. She knows everything about the physics of perception. She knows everything that you might think there is to know about color vision. Nonetheless, when she leaves the room and she looks at a ripe tomato for the very first time, something happens to her that gives her new knowledge, because despite all the knowledge that she had, she didn't know what it was like to look at a red thing until she left the room. And so the thought is that this shows that whatever we're going to think about the knowing what it's like for something to look red, it's clearly not going to be a physical property, because we assumed from the beginning that she knew everything there was to know about the physical properties. Okay, so I think that's a fair presentation of the thought experiment. So what do I think about this case? So my preferred view about the mind is very similar to Jack Smart's. So I'm a kind of old-fashioned identity theorist, roughly. So I think that, for example, perceptual states are largely, I mean, I'll ignore details about the kind of sort of relations to environmental history, environment, social relations, and so on, and just focus on the kind of brain. So, right, perceptual states are largely states of the brain. Now, what the kind of interesting question here is, if we're thinking about states as physical states of the brain, are there states that you can only know about fully if you're in them, right? So can you only know the kind of experiential dimension, as you might put it, of having looking at a red thing by being in the state of looking at a red thing or not, right? So here's a question, right? Is there some way that you could know about, from a physicalist point of view, about what it's like to look at a red thing, except by being in the state of looking at a red thing? Right. So there's two ways you could go here, right? Thinking about Mary. One thing is that you might think, look, while she's in the room, so long as she's equipped with enough surgical skill and knowledge and so on, she might be able to put herself into a state. She won't actually be looking at a red thing, but she'll be able to give herself, as it were, hallucinations of red things. And she'll be able to know what it's like because she's been able to put herself into that state. If she can't do that, then there's a kind of limitation on her because she can't occupy a certain state. That means that she will learn something when she leaves the room. Either way, it seems that this is perfectly consistent with the idea that the perceiving a red thing is a purely physical state, and that knowing what it's like for something to be red is also a purely physical state. So that's going to be the kind of way that I want to respond to the Jackson thought experiment.
Yeah, Dr. Humer, do you think that is there a significant difference between Nagel's what it's like for a bat? Is that the same? Are they both relevantly similar knowledge arguments?
Well, I mean, they're both appealing to qualia. I mean, Nagel makes this point, which I guess is not in Jackson's article that I remember about. So, like comparing other theoretical reductions and, saying there's a disanalogy.
Can I say something about that? So, yeah. I mean, the heat case might look favourable, but compare lightning and electrical discharge, right? I mean, there the kind of qualia question just doesn't arise for that kind of reduction.
I mean, well, there's the look of the lightning, right? Which,
yeah, but we're not interested in that.
Yeah, well, right, But that, I mean, that's why the theoretical reduction is okay, right? So like you don't explain the look of lightning
Hmm.
Right,
because we don't care. But in the case
right,
of qualia, you can't say, "Oh, we don't care."
right. But as I see it, the kind of issue here is whether we think that there are certain states, physical states, that you can only know what they're like by being in them.
Yeah.
Right, and
Well,
that's perfectly. That's perfect. It seems to me that that's a perfectly consistent position for
uh,
a
I mean,
physicalist like Smart, assuming that Smart was a physicalist. I mean, he was certainly an identity theorist for him to
well,
take.
I mean, I'm not sure that that's
Because,
the issue. Uh,
sorry,
I'm not sure that that's the issue, i.e., whether there are states that you can only know by being in them. So, like, I mean, I'm not sure that that's what the dualist is saying, right? So, I mean, it might be true that you can only know what it's like to see red by seeing red or hallucinating red. It might be true, but I don't think that's the essential point. So, like think about Hume's missing shade of blue, right? Where like,
yep.
you've seen some other shades of colors. There's a particular shade of color that you haven't seen, but you can imagine it because you've seen other colors in the spectrum. So, like maybe that's possible, right? But I mean,
Hmm.
I took it that the point was that it's possible to not know what one of these mental states is like, even though you know all the physical properties of it. And then that shows that
Right.
what it's like isn't one of the physical properties.
So I'm not sure how that doesn't fit with what I suggested. Right? It's possible for you not to know um, what it's like to be in certain kinds of physical states if you've never been in them. So it's possible for you to know to not know what it's like to be read, even though you know everything else about the physical properties. This is just for the physical properties, and there's a constraint on it, right?
Uh, wait.
Because I mean, we just said at the beginning that Mary knows all the physical facts, but there's this question about whether she really does or not, right? You can't just
Okay.
stipulate it, right?
Uh,
So if this
I
way of
mean,
thinking, if it turned out to be true, that there are some physical facts that you can only know by being in certain kinds of physical states, then there's no mystery about the fact that she doesn't know them because we've prevented her from being in those states.
Oh
We
oh,
took
yeah.
the
So
example.
you'd have to say that Mary can't know all the physical facts in the locked room, right?
Yeah,
Because there's some that
that's
I think Tim Crane goes for that route too. Yeah.
uh,
But
I
then that's not the
mean,
thought experiment, right?
well, I mean, this
no, but
makes
well,
me feel like I've lost my grip on what physical facts means. Because
right.
like, I took it that if you're claiming that this is a physical fact, you mean it's like one of these things about the locations of the particles and their arrangement and
Right.
their mass and charge and whatever.
Okay, so now that's good because now we come down to this question about whether I'm a physicalist or not, because um, so I'm certainly not thinking that there's a reduction of all properties to microphysical properties, and some people who are physicalists want to go that way. So I describe myself as a naturalist, and maybe once I tell you what my view is, you'll think, well, you're just not a physicalist at all,
Well,
right?
Dr. Oppy,
So,
can
so
you use the type token distinction too? Like, are you a type um do you go
so
in for type or
So
token? Yeah.
like a
so
token
that's
identity theorist. Yeah.
so that's a fair question. I think neither in the kind of way that Lewis opts for neither in Mad
Ah,
Pain and Martian Pain. So you have a kind of restricted type identity. So there's a kind of, you know, what it's like to see red for humans or something like that. But it's not what it's like to see red full stop. Um, but
okay.
maybe I'll go back to so I think of the universe as being, I don't know, we can think about the universe as having content at a whole lot of different scales. You can think of them as length dimensions. So we can think about if you could only see the universe at a very small level, right? You could kind of perceive it somehow. Well, let's so you're very small. You're on the kind of scale of the things that you're looking at, and we're down at the level of the quarks. And you think about the kind of I'll say properties. I'm tempted to talk about predicates, but let's just say properties, right? So the properties of that you need in order to describe what you can see down there is a kind of very narrow range of properties that are all couched in the language of kind of microphysics. Bump up a few levels in the scale to say the level of molecules. Or maybe a bit bigger, I don't know, proteins or something like that. And now when we start talking about the properties of things at this level, there'll be some new predicates that we need. We won't be able to just use these molecules have properties that quarks and electrons simply don't have. And so this is the kind of important part. I don't think that there's any way of defining the properties at the higher scale in terms of the properties at the lower scale, even in principle, right? So that there's an autonomy of I'll say, suppose we're now at the level of the chemical. Maybe that's not right, at the scale of the chemical. I'm trying to not use the word level. I'm trying to stick with the word scale, right? At the scale of the chemical. And this sort of is true at other scales as well. So when you get to the scale at which we exist, there's a whole lot of properties that are properly attributed to us that molecules don't have and that quarks don't have. And when you move up to the very, very biggest scales, we go back to, I mean, it's not the same properties at the micro scale, but it's just some physical properties, the only properties that are kind of attributable to the universe at really large scales turn out again to be, it's just that they're properties that belong to cosmology rather than to the physics of the very small.
Are those like an emergent properties then? Would
So
you use that word?
I don't like the word emergent, right? Because that kind of suggests that there's a privileging for
Yeah.
things at the lower level. Whereas I'm stepping away from this kind of privileging idea altogether, right? So I don't think of this as emergence. I just think of it as a kind of scale independence. So
when it comes to the mind, do you go in for something like Davidson's anomalous monism then?
no, I'm an identity theorist, right? But that's not a cross scale identification, right? You've got two things on the same scale, right? And so when people talk about reduction, they often talk about levels, and they think that the most fundamental things are going to sit at the bottom level, right? So there are some people who've kind of pushed back against that kind of way of thinking. So, for example, I know John Hyle's written quite a bit where he's sort of attacking the idea that there are levels of reality. And my thinking seems to converge with John's in various ways, and this is one of them.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Humer, what do you make of that?
I mean, it was sounding like the theory of emergence until he said that he didn't like the word emergence.
Right. That's what.
But I wonder if it's actually substantively is the theory of emergence, but you just don't like the term.
So it might be. It depends. It depends. What I mean, I'm not that familiar with what people have written about emergentism, so I would want to go and look to see whether it fits. Yeah. So here's one thing that I think is true, and maybe emergentists all accept this as well. But think about the space that I occupy, me, the kind of the organism, and think about what happens if you look at different scales just within the volume of space that I occupy. If you go down to the microphysical level, all you will find there are quarks and electrons, right? There are no, and those things don't have proto-consciousness or proto-mental properties or anything like that. And as you move up through the scales, you'll find is things that have chemical properties or biological properties or whatever as you go up and down the scales. So I don't know. Maybe emergentists think that too. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, do you get to qualia? I think that's Dr. Humer's. That's one of the points. Like, do you believe in qualia? At some point, does it? I can't. I don't know what else to say besides emerge. But does it come forth?
So, so that depends on whether we stick with what it's like. So, think about the ability to tell what color something is just by looking at it, right? That's presumably when she's in the black and white room. Mary just doesn't have that ability, because you can't have that ability unless you've seen some red things and some yellow things and some orange things, leaving aside the hallucination route, or messing with your brain or whatever. So I don't think of their qualia if those are kind of distinctively mental things or substances or something like that. But I'm prepared to go along with the idea that that there are certain skills that we have that depend upon our having been in certain kinds of states, so that we know what it's like to be in those states. Maybe that's enough to commit me to qualia. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm really curious, Dr. Human. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, so I don't think that we merely have skills. Right? So when Mary learns what it's like to see red, so it's true that maybe she requires a new skill for like identifying tomatoes and stuff. That's true, but also there's something else, which is that she knows a fact, which is that seeing red is like this, right? So right, like you can
Well,
imagine different ways the world could have been. Like there are different ways that seeing red could have been like, or it could have been different qualitative characters of that experience.
Yeah.
And when she sees a tomato for the first time now, like her evidence rules out a bunch of alternatives, right?
So I'm not sure whether that's different. I mean, it sounded different, but maybe it's the same as what I said, that she knows what it's like to see red, and that's a kind of knowledge that you can only have by being in the state of looking at something that's red, set up in the right kind of way.
But so she used that ability. I think if I'm tracking Dr. Humor, she used that ability to see red that she gained to then come to that phenomenal fact of red, and now like she has that, right? She can remember what it's like to see red and such, right? Like does that seem right? So it's not just the ability. The ability was used to acquire a phenomenal fact.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, you might think it was the other way around, right? She had to know what it was like in order to have the ability, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
got
Well,
the
either way,
kind
it
of
seems like
activation of the ability requires the knowledge. You have to know what it's like.
Yeah. I mean, so my interpretation of the case is, okay, she looks at the tomato and then she has a sensation, which we call the sensation of red, and she's directly aware of it because she's a self-conscious being, and she's aware of it having this particular qualitative character. She simultaneously forms the concept of that, because like she wouldn't even have the concept without having experienced it. But also now she knows that that qualitative character is experienced by people who are looking at red things and not some other qualitative character. So she's ruled out a set of possible worlds and ruled in the set of possible worlds. So that's a proposition, right? And also like there's a property that the experience has, which she didn't know that it had before. And so yeah, so and it looks like that property doesn't look like it's a physical property. If you say it is a physical property, I need to hear more about how that's a physical property.
Right. So I tried to tell the story about why I think it's a physical property before. But maybe, I mean, sorry, we had this disagreement about whether it's physical, right? It's and sorry, about whether I'm a physicalist, right? Because on the kind of emergentist view, if that's what my position is, it's not clear that I'm saying it's a physical property, right? But it seems to me that that if we're going to think about what sort of property is, it's going to be something like a neural property.
Yeah, so I want to move on to intentionality, but before I do, I wanted to ask each of you a question about dogs, which I think could clear some stuff up, or maybe not in Dr. Hummer's case, but Dr. Oppy, so if you were a type mind brain identity theorist, if you went in for the type identity theorist thesis, then a dog and you would not have the same red qualia experience, right? Because it wouldn't, that the type would be a physical thing in your brain. And I think this is what the multiple realizability argument against identity theory of the type variety goes with.
Yeah.
If you were a token theorist, it seems like that's functionalism to me and not identity theory, right? Like there's a type that can be multiply realized in the dog or in you, and as long as they're playing the same functional role. So when it comes to you and maybe my dog, do you guys both see red?
Okay, so one of the things that you said is really quite historically interesting, which is the question about whether identity theory and functionalism are compatible, consistent or not. So there was a kind of division of opinion in the 60s between kind of North American theorists like Putnam, who thought that they were inconsistent, and Antipodean theorists like Armstrong, who thought that they were perfectly consistent. Interestingly, Lewis sided with Armstrong on this question. Again,
makes sense, that Australian
Putnam,
connection.
But he did it, I think, by slightly changing the way that he was thinking about it, because he wasn't thinking that there's a single type here that everything has. He was thinking that maybe types would be restricted by kinds of entities. So maybe dog color vision really is a slightly different type of thing from human color vision. But he was assuming that amongst humans there was a common type. For seeing red, for example.
So maybe it could go along with like natural kinds or something like that. Okay. Yeah, there's just a lot of ways to cash it out. Dr. Humor, I maybe I shouldn't have picked dogs because I think they say dogs are colorblind, but let's just stipulate the dogs aren't colorblind right now, so I don't look too stupid. But Dr. Humor, you to have a qualia experience, you use qualia in order to argue for substance dualism. Does that mean if you and my puppy can both see red, that my puppy also has a soul?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and anything with mental states has a mind.
Okay.
And like the arguments that your mind isn't physical would, obviously also apply to the mind of anything that has a mind. So it's not like some of the minds are physical and some of them aren't.
Right? That's what, because I think Descartes was like, no, they're just automata, right? Like,
I mean, so he's denying that it has the experience at all. So, then it would be purely physical. But
gotcha. But if you think they do have the experience,